So earlier in the year, I made a video where I talked about my new airline route predictions for the year 2023, and so I thought I would make a video talking about my predictions that came true and the ones that didn't. I made about 25 predictions plus a few honorable mentions. First, I'm gonna talk about the 13 predictions that came true somewhat, and then the ones that didn't. And I will also make another video where I'm gonna make my predictions for the year 2024. That video should be coming out in the next week or two, so y'all stay tuned for that. Anyway, let's get started with my fulfilled predictions. I should probably mention that even if one part of the prediction came true, I'm gonna count it as fulfilled. Number 1. Play Airlines began flights to Hamilton, Canada. Now, in this one, I actually predicted Toronto Pearson and a bunch of US airports, and none of them came true. However, Play did begin flights to Hamilton, which is nearby Toronto, and can be convenient for passengers in the Toronto suburbs of Mississauga and others, but also cities like Hamilton and other nearby cities for flights to Europe via Reykjavik. Number 2. JetBlue began flights from New York and Boston to Amsterdam, which began earlier in the year. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport almost forced them to cancel these flights in 2024, but thankfully these plans were halted. So these flights are here to stay. Anyway, JetBlue also announced seasonal flights from New York and Boston to Dublin and year-round flights between Boston and Paris, which are going to begin next year. JetBlue also announced seasonal flights to Edinburgh, but these are not part of my prediction. Number 3. American Airlines turned Philadelphia to Lisbon and Barcelona into year-round flights. This was basically the only prediction that came true for American Airlines because no Airbus A321XLR destinations were announced because of delays in deliveries. Flights to Hong Kong did not resume, and other long-haul flights that I predicted also did not begin. Number 4. Turkish Airlines began flights to Detroit in November. Finally, the long-awaited flights to Detroit took off earlier in the year, but unfortunately, due to delays in deliveries, the flight to Denver did not begin this year. But Turkish did mention they plan to begin Denver flights as soon as they can, but we're gonna have to wait and see. Turkish also didn't launch flights to Rio as I predicted, and I don't think they will anytime soon because their focus is gonna be on launching flights to Australia. Number 5. United's long-haul expansion this year was massive, although most of those flights had been announced last year. But this year, United did resume flights between Washington and Sao Paulo and began Los Angeles to Brisbane on a seasonal basis. None of my other United predictions came true, and the Brisbane flight seems to be struggling because United is sending the flights earlier than planned. It is unclear whether they're going to resume their route next winter. Number 6. I made so many predictions for Delta, and the only ones that actually came true were New York to Rio de Janeiro, Minneapolis to Dublin, and Los Angeles to Auckland. Minneapolis to Dublin was actually quite interesting because at first it was Aer Lingus that announced this flight, and by the next day, Delta announced their own Minneapolis to Dublin flight. Delta's flight, however, will be seasonal, unlike Aer Lingus' year-round flight. Los Angeles to Auckland began as a seasonal, but Delta is upgrading this to a year-round flight, while New York to Rio is a seasonal which began alongside the resumption of Atlanta to Rio, which is going to be a year-round flight. Number 7. Aer Lingus announced new flights to Denver that will begin next year 2024. At the same time, they also announced the resumption of Dublin to Minneapolis, which will be in competition with Delta's service that I mentioned before. It is likely these two routes will be operated by the Airbus A321XLR once they are delivered to Aer Lingus. Number 8. Lufthansa is going to begin flights to Raleigh-Durham from Frankfurt. I had also predicted Nashville, however, Raleigh took the crown on this one. Number 9. Icelandair will begin flights to Pittsburgh. This route used to be operated by WOW Air a few years back, and I was expecting Play Airlines to begin the route. However, I also assumed that Icelandair would begin the route before Play even attempted it. I also figured they'd begin flights to secondary cities in the US since they began flights to Raleigh-Durham earlier in the year. Number 10. Air Canada made an interesting expansion this year. They began Vancouver to Washington Dulles and Toronto to Monterrey this year. I had predicted they'll begin flights from Montreal to Dubai, however, it was Emirates that began the route instead. But Air Canada did begin Vancouver to Dubai. I also predicted Air Canada would begin Vancouver to Orlando and Guadalajara, and they are happening. But Guadalajara is going to be flown by Flair and Orlando by Lynx Air instead. Number 11. North Atlantic began Paris to Miami and Oslo to Bangkok. Now, I had originally predicted Paris to Fort Lauderdale, since North was already flying to Fort Lauderdale, but North decided to end these flights and fly to Miami instead. I guess because there's a lot more revenue to be made at Miami when compared to Fort Lauderdale, so North began Paris to Miami instead. Norse also began Oslo to Bangkok, which was supposed to be a winter seasonal, but apparently is doing so well that they're going to be offering the route year round. Number 12, ITA Airways will begin flights to Chicago and Toronto in 2024. I had predicted these assuming that ITA would remain in the SkyTeam alliance. However, if Lufthansa buys ITA, then these routes make even more sense because Toronto and Chicago are Star Alliance hubs, where United and Air Canada have many connections. Now, last but not least, number 13, Azul began flights between Belo Horizonte and Fort Lauderdale. I did predict other routes, but none of them came true. Now, these are all 13 predictions of mine that became somewhat true. Now, on to my predictions that did not come to fruition. Number 1. American Airlines did not return to Hong Kong and did not begin Seattle to Shanghai. They also didn't launch Dallas to Tel Aviv. The latter two I can understand why American didn't launch, but I was really hoping Dallas to Hong Kong would resume. Number 2. Delta did not have a big transatlantic expansion in Boston as I expected. I expected him to launch at least 2 routes, maybe Milan and Brussels, but that did not happen. Number 13. I expected Air France or Delta to begin a new route to Paris. None of the destinations I predicted got a flight. However, Air France did begin flying to Raleigh-Durham, replacing Delta's flight on the route. This route will be operated using an Airbus A350 next summer, showing their strong demand on the route. Air France also began flights to Ottawa and Quebec City in Canada. I expected Air France to also add a third destination in Mexico, but that also didn't happen. But Aeromexico is planning to increase frequencies between Mexico City and Paris in 2024 for the Paris Olympics. Number 5, I also expected KLM or Delta to resume flights between Tampa and Amsterdam, but that did not happen. I also imagined they would begin flights to Raleigh-Durham or Cincinnati, which also didn't happen. Who knows, maybe next year Tampa flights will resume, but the slot restrictions at Amsterdam make that rather complicated. Number 6, similarly, I expected Virgin Atlantic to launch a new destination in the US. I predicted Detroit, Minneapolis, or Denver, but none of them happened. Virgin did, however, announce increased frequencies on flights to Miami, New York, and Boston, as well as the ending of flights to Austin, Texas. Number 7. British Airways did not open up a new route in North America. Well, they did to Cincinnati, but that was announced last year, but none of the cities that I predicted got a route. Number 8. I was expecting Alaska Airlines to add a new domestic destination from Seattle, especially Jacksonville or Hartford, but they didn't. Number 9. I had predicted that Iberia would launch flights from Madrid to Seattle and Finnair would launch Philadelphia, but honestly the latter was a ridiculous prediction, but Madrid to Seattle I think makes sense and could begin next year. Number 10, I predicted LOT Polish Airlines would announce flights to San Francisco and Washington Dulles, but they didn't. However, LOT did mention these cities earlier in the year as part of their future expansion plans, but no start date was announced. Number 11, Vietnam Airlines did not add a second U.S. destination. I wanted them to begin flights to Vancouver or Los Angeles, and I expected San Francisco to be upgraded to a daily flight, but none of that happened. Number 12, I expected Avianca to expand in the US. Now, one of my Instagram predictions came true with San Salvador to Las Vegas, but none of my predictions from my video last year came true. Number 13, Ethiopian Airlines did not return to Houston, Texas. They did, however, begin flights to Atlanta. I would, however, hope that Houston is Ethiopia's next destination in North America since they have mentioned multiple times that they want to return to Houston, and Houston wants Ethiopian Airlines back. Honorable mentions, none of them came true. Qantas did not add another U.S. destination, and neither did Fiji Airways. Gulf Air did not begin flights to New York, and Air India's U.S. expansion did not come as I expected, although the latter is likely to happen next year. And while that is all my 2023 predictions explain, not all of them came true, of course. Some were kind of ridiculous, and some of them I'm actually really proud of. But overall, I'm really happy with my predictions from this year. I am going to make another video for my 2024 predictions, which will hopefully be coming out next week. However, I did post my 2024 predictions on Instagram already, in case anybody wants to check them out. But either way, stay tuned next week for my 2024 predictions video. I wanted to make that video before year's end, however, I've been so busy and it's hard to keep up, so I decided to postpone that video for next week. Anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any questions, comments, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. That's all I gotta say, and I'll see y'all later.